"Which daughter of mine would you like?" he asked the mountain man. "Give me the fat one!" The words echoed across a dusty auction yard as a desperate father offered up his own children like cattle. The crowd roared with cruel laughter. But one rugged mountain man silenced them all with a single choice. He didn't take the pretty one. He didn't take the one they expected. He took the one they mocked. But this wasn't a bargain for a bride. It was the start of something no one in that town could have seen coming. Because when the railroad men arrived with papers in hand, when a fever struck down the father who sold his own, and when a hidden treaty map surfaced from a Ute scout's hands, the fate of land, family, and love hung in the balance. Was she a burden, as the town sneered, or the strongest woman the mountains had ever seen? And when the final bell tolled, would choosing the fat one prove to be the bravest act of his life, or the beginning of ruin? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Daisy's heart pounded against her ribs as Christian Brackett led her away from the livestock auction. The jeers and cruel laughter still rang in her ears, making her cheeks burn with shame. She kept her eyes fixed on her worn boots, watching them kick up little puffs of dust with each step. The winter wind whistled through the gaps in her thin shawl, but the cold wasn't what made her tremble. "Here," Christian said quietly, shrugging off his heavy wool coat. He draped it over her shoulders without breaking stride. The warmth of it enveloped her immediately, carrying the scent of pine smoke and leather. "Much obliged," she whispered, finally daring to glance up at him. His face was weathered but kind, with clear eyes that reminded her of summer skies. He walked with the easy confidence of a man who knew the wilderness, his broad shoulders squared against the wind. Behind them, the auction crowd's voices grew fainter, replaced by the crunch of their boots on the frozen ground. Daisy's mind whirled with questions she was afraid to ask. Why had this stranger chosen her? What would become of her sister Harriet and their father? How could he have done this to them? "I've got a cabin," Christian said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Up in the foothills. It ain't much, but it's warm and dry." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You'll have your own room with a proper door. No one'll trouble you there." Relief washed over Daisy like a spring rain. She'd half expected to be treated like the other livestock at auction, property to be used however the buyer saw fit. But there was something steadfast in Christian's manner that made her believe him. They passed the general store where Daisy had once worked, before father's drinking had cost them nearly everything. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, her mouth pinched in disapproval as she watched them pass. Daisy hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller. "Pay them no mind," Christian said, his voice low but firm. "Ain't their business anyway?" A wagon clattered past, the driver craning his neck to stare. Word would spread fast in a town this size. By sundown, everyone would know how Amos Harland had sold his daughters at auction, and how the mountain man had chosen the plump one that no one else wanted. The thought brought fresh tears to Daisy's eyes. She blinked them away, refusing to give the gossips more fuel. "What about my sister?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Christian's stride hitched for just a moment. "Reckon someone else'll make an offer. Your sister's the kind folks here approve of." There was no judgment in his tone, just simple truth. They were nearing the edge of town now. Christian's horse stood waiting, a sturdy bay gelding with patient eyes. Beside it, a heavily laden pack mule dozed in the weak winter sunlight. "Can you ride?" Christian asked, checking the saddle straps. Daisy nodded. "Pa taught us both when we were little, before—" She let the words trail off, not wanting to speak of better days. Christian's hands stilled on the leather. "Before your ma passed?" Yes. The word came out rough. 3 winters ago. Nothing's been right since then. Christian was quiet for a long moment, testing the cinch one final time. Lost my Sarah that way too, he said finally. Along with the baby she was carrying. His voice held old pain, carefully contained. Daisy's heart ached for him, this stranger who had saved her from public humiliation. She wanted to offer comfort, but didn't know how. Instead, she clutched his coat tighter around her shoulders and said, "I'm sorry." He nodded once, acknowledgement and acceptance in the gesture. Then he cupped his hands to give her a boost into the saddle. Daisy gathered her skirts and mounted as gracefully as she could, settling herself on the horse's broad back. Christian adjusted the stirrups for her shorter legs, his movements efficient but gentle. "Town's already behind us," he said, taking the horse's reins in one hand and the mule's lead in the other. "No need to look back unless you want to." Daisy straightened her spine, feeling something shift inside her. She had spent so long trying to make herself invisible, hunching her shoulders against the townspeople's scorn. But up here on Christian's horse, wrapped in his coat, she felt different. Not quite safe. Not yet, but protected. "I don't want to," she said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. A ghost of a smile touched Christian's lips. "Then we'll look forward." He clicked his tongue at the animals, and they started moving, leaving the town and its judgments in their wake. The winter sun cast long shadows as they made their way toward the foothills. Christian walked beside the horse, his stride steady and unhurried. Every so often he would point out landmarks, a lightning-struck pine that marked a turn in the trail, a rocky outcrop where mountain sheep sometimes gathered. Daisy found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. His clothes were well-worn but clean, his gear practical and well-maintained. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the land intimately. Everything about him spoke of capability and careful consideration. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Choose me, at the auction." Christian was silent for several steps, considering his answer. "Wasn't right," he said finally. "What your pa did, putting you girls up like that. Wasn't right how folks were acting either." He adjusted his grip on the reins. "Figured somebody ought to do something about it." "But why me?" Daisy pressed, needing to understand. "Harriet's the pretty one, the one everyone likes." Christian stopped walking and turned to look up at her, his eyes serious. "Pretty ain't everything, Miss Daisy. I watched you at that auction. Saw how you held yourself up straight, even with all them people laughing. Saw how you kept your dignity when others were trying to strip it away." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That kind of strength, that's worth more than any pretty face." Daisy felt warmth bloom in her chest, different from the physical warmth of his coat. No one had ever spoken to her like this before, like she had value beyond her appearance. They continued on as the afternoon light began to fade. The trail grew steeper, winding through stands of pine and aspen. The horse picked its way carefully over the rocky ground, while the pack mule followed dutifully behind. "Almost home," Christian said as they rounded a bend. "Cabin's just ahead." Daisy saw smoke rising through the trees, and then the cabin came into view. It was small but solid-looking, with a neat stack of firewood along one wall and a small barn set back among the trees. A creek burbled nearby, its banks lined with ice. Christian helped her down from the horse, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "It ain't much," he said again, almost apologetically. "But it's peaceful here. Safe." Daisy looked at the cabin, then at the man beside her. In the space of a few hours, her entire world had shifted. The future that had seemed so bleak that morning now held possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Christian's eyes met hers, understanding passing between them. "Welcome home, Miss Daisy," he said simply, and led the way toward the cabin door. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. As Daisy followed Christian toward her new home, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope, fragile as a spring flower pushing through snow, but growing stronger with each step. Christian guided Daisy away from the auction grounds, his steady hand at her elbow providing silent support as they made their way through the snowy street. The winter wind whipped around them, carrying whispers and stares from the dispersing crowd. Daisy kept her eyes fixed on the ground, watching their boots make tracks in the fresh snow. When they reached a quiet spot near the livery stable, Christian cleared his throat. "Miss Daisy," he said softly, "I need to explain something to you." She tensed, waiting for whatever cruel joke or demand might follow. But Christian's voice remained gentle, his weathered face earnest as he continued. "I didn't mean to purchase you back there. That ain't right. Treating people like cattle for sale." He shook his head, disgust evident in his expression. "I only wanted to stop what was happening. No person should be put up for auction like that." Daisy's throat tightened. Of course he hadn't really wanted her. Who would? But there was something in his tone, a steadiness that made her look up and meet his eyes. "What happens now?" she whispered. Christian gestured to a woodpile stacked against the livery wall. "Let's sit a spell. You look like you could use a rest, and we've got things to discuss." The rough-hewn logs were cold through her thin dress, but Daisy was grateful to be off her shaking legs. Christian settled beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped package. "Dried venison," he explained, offering her a piece. "Not fancy, but it'll give you strength." Daisy accepted the meat with trembling fingers. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. Everything about this day had stolen her appetite. But the venison was surprisingly sweet, and her empty stomach reminded her it needed filling. "I've got a cabin," Christian said as she ate. "Up in the mountains, about half a day's journey. It's simple, but it's warm and dry." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You'd be welcome to stay there, just until you decide what path you want to take. No obligations, no expectations, just a safe place to rest and think." Daisy's fingers stilled on the venison. It seemed too good to be true, this stranger offering shelter with no demands. But before she could respond, heavy footsteps crunched in the snow behind them. "There you are, girl!" Amos Harlan's voice cracked like a whip. Daisy flinched as her father stormed toward them, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "Think you can just run off without a proper sale being made?" Christian rose slowly to his feet, his broad shoulders straight. "Mr. Harland," he said calmly, "I've got coin to cover what you're owed, but I won't stand by and watch you treat your daughters like livestock." Amos's face darkened further. "Ain't your business how I handle my family affairs? That girl's been nothing but a burden since her ma died, eating more than her share, taking up space, scaring off decent suitors with her size." His words slurred slightly as he jabbed a finger in Daisy's direction. Daisy felt each word like a physical blow, but Christian didn't waver. He pulled out a leather pouch and counted out several coins, holding them out to Amos. "This should cover any debts you're claiming. Take it, and let's end this properly." Amos snatched the money, letting a few coins fall in the snow. As he bent to retrieve them, he muttered, "Doubt you'll get your money's worth out of that one. Never been worth the feed it takes to keep her." Christian's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. I reckon that's where you and I differ in our measuring of worth, Mr. Harland. He turned his back on Amos, effectively dismissing him, and faced Daisy. Miss, if you're willing, I'll get the sled ready. Night's coming on, and we've got a fair piece to travel. Daisy looked past Christian to where her father was stumbling away, counting his coins. Then she glanced toward the town, where warm lamplight was beginning to glow in windows. Somewhere in one of those houses, her sister Harriet was probably already finding a place among the respectable folks who had always welcomed her. But for Daisy, there was no welcome in those windows, only judgment, whispers, and the memory of today's humiliation. She looked up at Christian, searching his face for any sign of deception. She found only patience and quiet strength. I'll come with you, she said softly, surprising herself with how firm her voice sounded. Christian nodded once, then offered his hand to help her up from the woodpile. Wait here where it's sheltered. I'll fetch the mule and sled. Daisy watched as he disappeared into the livery stable. The wind was picking up, carrying the first fresh snowflakes of evening. They swirled around her like tiny dancers, catching in her hair and on her eyelashes. Everything felt dreamlike, the events of the day too strange to be real. Christian returned, leading a sturdy-looking mule hitched to a well-maintained sled. He had loaded it with supplies and covered everything with oiled canvas to keep out the snow. Small bells attached to the harness tinkled softly as the mule shook its head. It ain't a fancy carriage, Christian said, adjusting the harness, but old Bess here knows these mountain trails better than any horse. She'll get us home safe. Home. The word echoed in Daisy's mind as Christian helped her onto the sled, tucking warm buffalo robes around her. She had no idea what awaited her at his cabin, but anything seemed better than staying in a town that had watched her being auctioned off like a piece of livestock. The bells on Bess's harness chimed softly as they started moving, their sound muffled by the falling snow. Christian sat beside Daisy, giving her plenty of space while still sharing his warmth. The town began to fade behind them, its lights growing dimmer in the gathering dusk. Daisy watched the snowflakes dance in the dying light, each one unique and perfect before melting away. Like hopes, she thought, so beautiful and so fragile. But for the first time in years, she felt something new stirring in her heart. Not quite hope. She wasn't ready for that yet, but perhaps the possibility of hope. The sled moved steadily through the deepening night, Bess's hooves making soft, crunching sounds in the fresh snow. Christian remained silent beside her, a steady presence that somehow made the darkness less frightening. The gentle chiming of the bells became a lullaby, and Daisy found her eyelids growing heavy despite her anxiety about what lay ahead. As they left the last traces of town behind, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and slowly erasing all signs of the path they had taken. Like a clean page waiting for a new story to be written, Daisy thought, and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, that this journey might lead to something better than what she was leaving behind. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the snow-covered landscape. Daisy blinked awake as the sled hit a bump, drawing her father's threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The night's journey had left her stiff, but the morning sun promised some warmth despite the winter chill. Christian guided the mule with steady hands, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The trail wound steadily upward through stands of pine and aspen, their branches laden with fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the early light. "Reckon we've got about 6 hours ahead of us?" Christian said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Trail gets steeper as we go, but Bess knows the way." He patted the mule's flank affectionately. "Cabin's up near timberline, where the hunting's good and the stream runs clear year-round." Daisy nodded, watching frost crystals form delicate patterns on nearby branches. Her thoughts drifted to Harriet, and worry gnawed at her heart. As if reading her mind, Christian spoke again. "Before we left town, I had word sent to Widow Jensen about your sister. She's a good woman, takes in girls sometimes who need shelter. Your sister won't want for anything." Relief flooded through Daisy, though it was tinged with a familiar ache. Even in this, Harriet would land on her feet, finding comfort among the respectable folk who had always preferred her. The morning wore on as they climbed higher into the foothills. Christian kept Bess at a steady pace, never rushing the sure-footed animal. The sled runners whispered through the snow, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk's cry echoed against the mountainside. When the sun reached its peak, Christian guided Bess off the trail into a small clearing. "Time we took some rest," he said, helping Daisy down from the sled. Her legs trembled from sitting so long, and she steadied herself against the wooden rails. Christian worked efficiently, gathering dry wood from beneath snow-laden branches, and soon had a small fire crackling. He pulled supplies from the sled, a battered coffee pot, some hard bread, and dried meat. The coffee's aroma soon filled the clearing, rich and warming. What caught Daisy's attention most was how Christian tended to Bess before seeing to their own meal. He checked each of the mule's hooves carefully, brushing away packed snow and examining for any signs of strain or injury. His large hands moved with surprising gentleness as he offered Bess some feed and patted her neck. "She's a good girl," he said, catching Daisy watching. "Been with me 5 years now. Smart as any human and twice as loyal." There was genuine affection in his voice, and something in Daisy's chest loosened a little at this evidence of his kindness. They shared the simple meal in companionable silence, the coffee hot enough to warm their hands through the tin cups. The sun had begun its westward slide when they packed up and continued their journey, the trail growing steeper and narrower. Shadows lengthened across the snow as dusk approached. The temperature dropped sharply, and Daisy huddled deeper into her shawl. Just when she thought she couldn't bear the cold any longer, Christian pointed ahead. "There it is. Home." Through the gathering gloom, Daisy saw smoke curling from a stone chimney. The cabin emerged from the trees like a painting. Rough-hewn logs stacked neat and solid against the mountainside, a small barn to one side, all of it tucked into a natural clearing among towering pines. Christian helped her down from the sled, then led Bess toward the barn. "Go on inside," he said, handing her a key. "Fire should still be going. I banked it good before heading to town. Make yourself comfortable while I see to Bess." Daisy's hands shook as she fitted the key into the lock. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a space that was plain but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its banked coals giving off welcome heat. A narrow bed stood in one corner, its quilts neat and folded. Tools hung along the walls, axes, saws, traps, and implements she didn't recognize. Stacked firewood filled a space near the hearth. She stood just inside the doorway, uncertain what to do. This man's home. This stranger who had saved her from public shame, yet whom she barely knew. Fear of the unknown warred with bone-deep relief at being away from the town's cruel stares and whispered judgments. The door opened behind her, letting in a blast of cold air as Christian entered. He carried their supplies from the sled, setting them down carefully before closing the door. Without comment, he moved to the fireplace, adding wood and stirring the coals until flames licked upward. "Here," he said, holding out a thick wool blanket. You must be half frozen. Sit by the fire and warm yourself." He gestured to a sturdy wooden chair pulled close to the hearth. Daisy wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and sank into the chair, extending her cold hands toward the growing flames. The heat seeped slowly into her bones, and with it came exhaustion from the long journey. Christian moved quietly around the cabin, putting things away, adding more wood to the fire, filling a kettle with water from a barrel in the corner. His movements were sure and practiced, speaking of years living alone in this space. "It's not much," he said finally, pausing in his work, "but it's dry and warm and you'll be safe here." He met her eyes directly. "I meant what I said in town. You can stay as long as you need, until you decide what path you want to take. No obligations." Daisy nodded, unable to find words past the lump in her throat. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney, while outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs heavy with snow. In this moment, seated by a stranger's hearth, Daisy felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the faintest stirring of peace. The cabin was simple, far from the comfortable homes in town where her sister might be sleeping tonight. But there were no sneering faces here, no cruel laughter or measuring eyes, just quiet and warmth, and the presence of a man who had shown more kindness to her in one day than she'd known since her mother died. As Christian moved about the cabin, preparing a simple supper, Daisy watched the flames dance in the fireplace. Each flicker seemed to burn away a little more of yesterday's shame, replacing it with something new and fragile. Not quite hope, but perhaps its beginning. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, Daisy lay beneath thick quilts, her eyes fluttering open at an unfamiliar sound. The rhythmic thud of an axe split the morning silence, each strike echoing against the mountainside. She pushed back the covers, shivering as her feet touched the cold wooden floor. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only glowing embers. Through the frost-covered window, she could see Christian's broad figure, his breath visible in the cold air as he swung the axe in steady arcs. The cabin felt different in the morning light, less threatening, more real. Shelves lined one wall, holding various supplies. Her eyes fell on a container of oats, and something stirred inside her. Here was something she could do, something useful. She found a pot and added water from the barrel Christian had shown her the night before. The stove took some figuring. It was smaller than the one she'd used in town, but soon she had a fire going inside it. The familiar motions of stirring porridge brought comfort, a small piece of normal in this strange new world. The door opened, bringing a rush of cold air and Christian's tall frame. He carried an armload of split wood, his cheeks ruddy from exertion. He paused, surprise flickering across his features at the sight of her by the stove. "Thought I smelled something cooking," he said, stacking the wood neatly by the fireplace. "Didn't expect you to be up so early." "Your axe woke me," Daisy replied, stirring the thickening porridge. "Hope you don't mind. I found the oats on the shelf." "Mind?" Christian's mouth curved in a slight smile. "Been a long while since anyone cooked breakfast in this cabin besides me." They ate at the small table, steam rising from their bowls. The porridge was plain, but Daisy had found a bit of dried apple to add, and Christian seemed to appreciate it, finishing every bite. "Time you learned a few things about mountain living," he said after they'd cleaned up. "If you're willing." Daisy nodded, eager to prove herself useful. Christian led her outside, where the morning sun had begun to warm the air. He showed her the path to the creek, explaining how to break through the ice to fetch water and the importance of keeping the bucket covered on the return journey to prevent spilling. "Water's precious up here," he said, demonstrating how to dip the bucket beneath the flowing water under the ice. Creek's fed by a spring that never freezes, but getting to it can be tricky in winter. Daisy's first attempt at carrying the full bucket up the slight incline to the cabin resulted in more water on her skirts than in the container. But Christian didn't laugh or scold. He simply showed her again, explaining how to balance the weight against her hip. Next came a lesson in stacking wood. Logs need to be crossed, Christian explained, demonstrating the pattern. Keeps them stable, lets air flow between them to keep dry. His large hands moved with surprising grace, each piece fitting perfectly into place. Daisy's attempts were less precise, the pile looking more like a jumbled mess than the neat stack Christian had created. Her fingers, unused to such work, quickly grew cold and clumsy. "You'll get the feel of it," Christian said, adjusting one of her logs. "Took me time to learn too." His patience seemed endless, his quiet instruction never turning to criticism. As the sun climbed toward noon, Christian retrieved his rifle from above the fireplace. "Thought we might try hunting," he said, checking the weapon with practiced hands. "Saw some rabbit tracks this morning?" Daisy had never been hunting before. She followed Christian into the woods, trying to match his quiet steps. He pointed out different tracks in the snow, deer, fox, and finally, the small prints they were seeking. "There," he whispered, pointing to a flash of movement near a fallen log. "Watch how still they get when they sense something." The rifle's crack shattered the forest quiet. Daisy jumped, her heart racing, but forced herself to remain steady. Christian nodded approvingly at her composure as he went to retrieve their dinner. "Most folks jump a lot higher first time they hear a shot up close," he said, carefully cleaning the rabbit. He showed her how to check the meat for fitness, explaining what to look for and what to avoid. The afternoon passed in more lessons: how to tell weather from cloud patterns, which trees made the best firewood, how to spot signs of approaching storms. Daisy's head spun with new information, but she found herself eager to learn more. As evening approached, they returned to the cabin. Christian showed her how to prepare the rabbit for cooking, his skilled hands guiding hers through the process. Soon, a rich stew bubbled on the stove, filling the cabin with savory aromas. They sat by lamplight, warm bowls in hand. The stew was simple but satisfying, chunks of rabbit mixed with dried vegetables from Christian's winter stores. Daisy watched the lamp flame flicker against the walls, feeling the weight of the day's lessons. "I fear I'm more trouble than help," she said softly, voicing the worry that had nagged at her all day. "Everything takes me so long to learn." Christian set down his spoon, regarding her thoughtfully. "No burden where there's willingness," he said simply. "You're trying. That's what matters up here." Outside, the wind began to rise, whistling through the pine trees. The shutters rattled against the cabin walls as gusts grew stronger. Christian rose to check the fire, adding several logs to keep the cold at bay. "Storm's coming," he said, returning to his seat. "Might be a long night." The wind increased, making the cabin walls creak and groan. Daisy pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching as Christian moved about the cabin, securing what needed securing. He checked the shutters, added more wood to the fire, and filled the water barrel to the brim. "Mountain storms can last days," he explained, settling back into his chair. "Best to be prepared." The gale outside grew fiercer, but inside the cabin remained warm and secure. Daisy found herself grateful for the solid walls around her, for the fire's steady heat, and for the quiet company of the man who had brought her here. The lamp cast dancing shadows as they finished their meal, the storm's voice rising to a howl outside. Yet somehow Daisy felt safer than she had in years. Here, In this simple cabin with its creaking walls and flickering lamplight, she had found something she hadn't expected. A chance to be useful, to learn, to perhaps become something more than the fat one from the auction block. Christian added one final log to the fire, its crack and pop a counterpoint to the wind's fury. They sat in comfortable silence, the storm raging outside while they remained warm and dry within. Tomorrow would bring more lessons, more attempts at mastering mountain skills, but for now, Daisy allowed herself to simply be present in this moment of peace. The storm raged for 3 days, keeping Christian and Daisy confined to the cabin. When the winds finally died down and the sky cleared to a crisp winter blue, Christian announced it was time to replenish their supplies. "Storm's taken most of our flour," he said, checking their stores. "Need lamp oil too before the next weather comes in." Daisy's stomach tightened at the thought of returning to town. The memory of the auction still burned fresh in her mind. But they needed supplies, and she knew she couldn't hide in the mountains forever. Christian readied the mule, while Daisy wrapped herself in her worn shawl. The morning air bit cold and sharp, their breath forming clouds in the sunlight. The mule's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they began their descent from the timberline. "Town will be busy after the storm," Christian said, walking beside the mule. "Everyone will need restocking." Daisy nodded, her fingers twisting in her shawl. "I reckon they'll all remember that auction day." "Let them remember," Christian replied steadily. "Ain't nothing to be ashamed of in surviving." The journey down took most of the morning. As they approached the outskirts of town, Daisy could already feel eyes turning their way. Whispers followed them down the main street, carried on the winter air. "That's the one sold cheap at auction," a woman's voice carried from the dry goods store porch. "Harlan's girl," another added. "The heavy one." Daisy kept her chin tucked down, studying the packed snow beneath her feet. Christian's presence beside her remained solid and calm, like a buffer against the cruel words. They tied the mule outside the general store. Inside, the warmth carried the scent of coffee and tobacco. The shopkeeper barely glanced their way as Christian began selecting supplies: flour, coffee beans, dried meat. A group of men by the pot-bellied stove stopped talking as Daisy passed, their silence more cutting than words. She focused on examining a shelf of preserved goods, pretending not to notice their stares. "Heard you got yourself quite a bargain, Brackett," one finally called out, his voice thick with meaning. Christian continued measuring flour into a sack, his movements unhurried. "Reckon that's between me and the Lord," he answered, his tone quiet but firm. Before anyone could respond, the shop door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and Mrs. Palmer, the town's seamstress. The older woman's face brightened at the sight of Daisy. "Why, Daisy Harland, I've been wondering how you were faring," she said warmly, approaching with open arms. "You look well, dear. Mountain air must agree with you." The genuine kindness in her voice nearly brought tears to Daisy's eyes. Mrs. Palmer had always been kind, even when others weren't. "Yes, ma'am," Daisy managed. "Mr. Brackett's been teaching me about mountain living." "Good, good," Mrs. Palmer patted her arm. "You come see me before you leave town. I've some warm woolens that might fit you better than that thin dress." Christian finished his purchasing, adding lamp oil to their supplies. He paid without comment, though Daisy noticed how the shopkeeper avoided meeting his eyes. They were loading the supplies onto the mule when a sharp voice cut through the winter air. "Miss Harland," a well-dressed man strode toward them, his boots leaving precise prints in the snow. His manner spoke of authority, and the badge on his coat identified him as a railroad company foreman. "Mr. Carver?" Daisy said quietly, recognizing him from previous visits to town. "Fortunate I caught you," he said, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a sheaf of papers, holding them out to her. "These concern your father's property?" Daisy took the papers with trembling fingers. As she read, her face paled. "But this can't be right," she protested, looking up at Carver. "This says the land is being seized for the railroad. My father still lives there." Carver's expression remained impassive. "Your father's debts have made the property vulnerable to acquisition. The railroad requires that land for expansion. Come spring, we'll begin laying track." "But where will he go?" Daisy's voice cracked. "That land is all we have." "That's hardly the railroad's concern," Carver replied coldly. "Eviction notices will be posted when the snow melts. Good day, Miss Harland." He turned and walked away, leaving Daisy clutching the papers in the cold air. Christian stepped closer, his solid presence steadying her as she swayed. "Let me see those papers," he said quietly. Daisy handed them over, watching as he read through them carefully. His expression darkened as he reached the end. "They can't just take it," Daisy whispered. "Can they?" "There's always a way to fight," Christian answered, carefully folding the papers. "And you won't be facing this alone." They made one last stop at Mrs. Palmer's shop, where the seamstress insisted on gifting Daisy with a warm wool shawl and sturdy stockings. The kindness brought fresh tears to Daisy's eyes. The return journey began in silence, the mule's steady gait carrying them back toward the mountains. Snow began to fall, light flakes dancing in the afternoon air. Daisy gripped the papers in her pocket, her mind spinning with worry for her father. "What can we do?" she finally asked, her voice small against the vast white landscape. Christian adjusted the mule's lead rope before answering. "First, we'll check on your father. Then we'll look into these papers proper. Railroad companies may be powerful, but they ain't above the law." The mule trudged patiently through the deepening snow, its breath steaming in the cold air. Daisy watched the flakes settle on Christian's broad shoulders, drawing comfort from his steady presence and unwavering support. The whispers and stares of town fell away behind them as they climbed higher into the mountains. Yet Daisy knew they'd face them again, not just the town's judgment now, but the railroad's threat to her family's land. The papers in her pocket felt heavy with the weight of the challenge ahead. But Christian's words echoed in her mind. She wouldn't face this fight alone. Somehow that made the burden a little lighter to bear as they made their way home through the gently falling snow. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them as Christian stoked the fire for the evening. Shadows danced across the rough-hewn walls, and the wind whispered through the gaps in the logs. Daisy sat in the wooden chair near the hearth, the railroad papers spread across her lap, her fingers tracing the harsh legal words again and again. "What'll become of them?" she whispered, more to herself than to Christian. "Pa can barely feed himself, and Harriet." Her voice caught. "She's always been the delicate one. This'll break her heart, losing our home." Christian settled onto a stool nearby, his presence steady as always. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark hair as he studied her worried face. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "when the path ahead seems darkest, that's when we most need to remember we don't walk it alone." Daisy looked up, catching something in his tone that made her pause. Christian's eyes were fixed on the dancing flames, his expression thoughtful. "Would you mind," he asked softly, "if I offered up a prayer?" The request surprised her. In all their days together, they hadn't spoken much of faith. Daisy's own prayers had dried up years ago when her mother's fever had taken her, despite all the desperate pleading of a young girl. I suppose not," she answered hesitantly. Christian bowed his head, his voice taking on a gentle reverence that filled the quiet cabin. "Lord, we come before you tonight with heavy hearts. You know the burden your daughter carries for her family. You see the threat to their home, the weight of worry she bears. Guide us in wisdom, show us the path through this valley. Remind us that your providence is greater than any railroad company, that your plans reach further than we can see." Daisy found her own head bowing, something long dormant stirring in her chest as Christian continued. "Grant comfort to her father and sister. Protect them through these winter months. And Lord, help us to trust in your timing even when the way seems dark. In your name we pray, Amen." The simple words hung in the air, and Daisy was startled to feel tears on her cheeks. She hadn't cried since that awful day at the auction, hadn't allowed herself to feel so vulnerable. But something in Christian's prayer had cracked open a door she'd thought forever sealed. "Thank you," she whispered, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. I stopped praying after Ma died. Felt like God wasn't listening anymore." "He listens," Christian said gently, "even when we're too hurt to hear his answer." They sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled, each lost in their own thoughts. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters, but inside the cabin felt like a sanctuary. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. Daisy emerged from the cabin to find Christian already at work, clearing paths through the fresh snow. "I want to learn to ride," she announced, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "The mule, I mean. If I'm to be any help around here, I need to learn." Christian paused in his work, leaning on his shovel. "You sure? Trail's mighty slick after the storm." "I'm sure," Daisy said firmly, though her stomach fluttered at the thought. "Can't spend the rest of winter afraid of everything new." A smile tugged at the corner of Christian's mouth. "Reckon you're right about that." He stuck the shovel in a snowbank and headed for the lean-to where the mule was housed. "Come on then. You'll want to meet Solomon proper-like first." "Solomon?" "The mule," Christian explained, leading the animal out. "Named him for wisdom. He's got more sense than most men I know." Solomon's long ears twitched as they approached. Christian showed Daisy how to offer her palm flat, letting the mule sniff her hand. His whiskers tickled her skin, and she giggled despite herself. "He's gentler than I expected," she admitted, stroking Solomon's broad forehead. "Most creatures are, once you get to know them," Christian replied, adjusting the saddle blanket. "Now, watch how I place this saddle. You'll need to know every step." He walked her through the process of saddling, explaining each strap and buckle. Then came the moment to mount. Christian's strong hands steadied her waist as she put her foot in the stirrup, and with an ungraceful heave, she found herself astride Solomon's broad back. "Oh!" she gasped, gripping the saddle horn. The ground seemed very far away. "You're doing fine," Christian assured her, keeping one hand on Solomon's lead rope. "Just sit straight and breathe. Solomon knows his job." They started slow, Christian walking beside them as Solomon picked his way carefully through the snow. At first, Daisy felt like she might slide off with every step, but gradually she began to find her balance. "That's it," Christian encouraged. "Move with him. Don't fight against his rhythm." They made their way along the cleared trail, Solomon's hooves crunching in the snow. The morning sun warmed Daisy's face, and the view from horseback showed her the mountain world from a new perspective. Everything looked different from up here, more expansive somehow. When Solomon stumbled slightly on a hidden ice patch, Daisy clutched the saddle horn and let out a surprised laugh. The sound echoed off the snow-covered pines, startling her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed out loud. Christian glanced up at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sounds like you're enjoying yourself." "I am," she realized wonderingly. "I truly am." They worked their way further along the trail, Christian pointing out landmarks and teaching her to guide Solomon with gentle pressure from her legs. When they reached a clearing scattered with fallen pine cones, Christian helped her dismount. "Might as well make this ride useful," he said, pulling a burlap sack from his coat pocket. "These make fine kindling once they're dried. Start gathering the biggest ones you can find." Daisy's legs felt wobbly from the ride, but she set to work, finding satisfaction in the simple task. They worked, together, their breath making clouds in the cold air as they collected pine cones and dry branches for kindling. "My ma used to say idle hands make heavy hearts," Daisy said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Reckon she was right about that." Christian nodded, adding another branch to his bundle. "Your ma sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Daisy said softly. "She taught me to sew, to cook, to care for a home. Said a woman's worth isn't in her face or figure, but in her capable hands and caring heart." "Smart lady," Christian replied, his voice gentle. They loaded their gathered kindling onto Solomon's back and made their way home as the afternoon light began to fade. Daisy's muscles ached from the unaccustomed riding, but it was a good kind of ache, one that spoke of accomplishment rather than shame. That evening, after their simple supper, Daisy noticed a tear in the sleeve of Christian's work shirt, thrown over the back of his chair. Without a word, she retrieved her mother's old sewing kit from her bundle of belongings. The lamplight was poor for detailed work, but her fingers remembered the familiar motion of needle and thread. Christian sat nearby, working on mending a piece of tack, the quiet broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. When she finished, she handed him the shirt wordlessly. He examined her neat stitches, running a calloused thumb over the repair. "Thank you," he said quietly, the simple words carrying more weight than their size should allow. Daisy nodded, suddenly shy under his steady gaze. Something was growing between them, something as delicate as a spring seedling pushing through snow. Neither of them spoke of it, but she could feel it in moments like these, in shared work, in comfortable silences, in the way he always seemed to know when she needed encouragement or space. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Outside, an owl called into the night, its lonely sound echoing off the mountainside. But inside, Daisy felt warmer than she had in years, surrounded by the simple evidence of her own worth. The ache in her muscles from riding, the pine cones they'd gathered together, the shirt she'd mended with caring hands. She glanced at Christian, who sat lost in thought, his strong profile outlined by the fading firelight. He caught her looking and gave her one of his quiet smiles, the kind that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. Daisy smiled back, then returned to her mending basket, her heart full of a feeling she wasn't quite ready to name. The Sunday morning dawned bright and cold, sunlight glinting off fresh snow. Daisy had just finished hanging fresh herbs to dry from the cabin's rafters when she heard the crunch of boots on snow. Through the window, she spotted a dark figure making its way up the winding trail. The town preacher, Reverend Walker, his black coat stark against the white landscape. Christian stepped out to meet him, wiping his hands on his work pants. The two men stood in stark contrast, the preacher rigid and proper in his Sunday best, Christian comfortable in his frontier garb. "Brother Brackett," Reverend Walker's voice carried sharp and clear in the mountain air. "I've come about a matter of grave concern." Christian nodded respectfully, but said nothing, waiting. Daisy moved closer to the door, her heart beginning to race. "May I come in?" the preacher asked, though his tone made it more demand than question. Christian held the door, and Reverend Walker stepped into the cabin's warmth. His eyes swept the simple space, taking in the single bed, the cooking area, the chair where Daisy's mending lay. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Miss Harland," he acknowledged stiffly. "I trust you are, well?" "Yes, Reverend," Daisy replied softly, feeling heat rise in her cheeks under his scrutiny. The preacher cleared his throat. "Brother Brackett, I must speak plainly. The town is alive with talk about this situation." He gestured between them. "A single man and woman living alone in these mountains without benefit of marriage vows, it's unseemly. It goes against all proper Christian conduct." Daisy's face burned hotter. She clutched her apron, twisting the fabric between her fingers. "With respect, Reverend," Christian's voice remained steady. "Miss Harland's honor is completely intact. She has her own sleeping space, and I've treated her with nothing but proper courtesy." "Intentions matter little in the face of appearance," Reverend Walker countered. "Gossip spreads faster than wildfire, and reputations, once damaged, are not easily mended." He turned to Daisy. "My dear, surely you must see how this arrangement compromises your standing in the community." Daisy's throat tightened. She thought of the whispers in town, the sidelong glances, the way some women had drawn their skirts aside when she passed. "I've given her no cause for shame," Christian said firmly. His shoulders were tense, though his voice remained respectful. "She needed shelter and protection, nothing more." "The road to perdition is paved with good intentions," the preacher quoted. "If you truly wish to protect her, you should either make her your wife or find her more suitable arrangements in town." Silence fell heavy in the cabin. Daisy's heart hammered against her ribs. The thought of returning to town, to the mockery and judgment, made her feel ill. But marriage? She glanced at Christian, whose face had gone carefully blank. "I'll consider your counsel, Reverend," Christian said finally. "But Miss Harland's fate is her own to decide." The preacher sighed heavily. "Very well. But remember, the Lord sees all, and so do wagging tongues." He adjusted his coat. "I'll pray for you both." Christian walked him to the door. They watched the black-clad figure descend the trail until he disappeared among the trees. Daisy sank into a chair, her legs trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." Christian turned to her, his expression softening. "You've brought no trouble. The Reverend means well, but he sees the world in stark lines of black and white. Up here, we know life holds more shades than that." He moved to stoke the fire, his movements deliberate. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls as afternoon faded toward evening. Daisy watched him, sensing something unspoken weighing on his mind. Finally, Christian settled into his chair by the hearth. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. "Something I should have told you before." Daisy waited, her hands folded in her lap. "I was married once," he continued, his voice rough. "Her name was Sarah. She was everything bright and good in my world." He paused, staring into the flames. "She died 7 years ago, bringing our child into the world. Neither of them survived." Daisy's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I made a vow that day," Christian said. "Swore I'd never risk loving again, never put another woman in harm's way." His hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "Thought I could live alone up here, just me and my memories." Understanding dawned in Daisy's heart. His gruffness, his solitude, his careful distance, all of it stemmed from this old wound. "But life has its own plans," he added softly. "When I saw you at that auction, something wouldn't let me walk away. Couldn't bear to see you treated like that." Wolves howled in the distance, their mournful song echoing off the mountainsides. Daisy rose from her chair and moved to stand beside Christian. Carefully, gently, she placed her hand on his arm. He stiffened slightly at her touch, then relaxed. They stood there in silence as the wolves called to each other through the gathering dusk. Two souls bound by circumstance and growing trust, each carrying their own burdens of past pain and present uncertainty. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the darkness, the wolves sang their ancient songs. But inside the cabin, in that moment of shared understanding, Daisy felt safer than she had in years. Neither spoke for a long while. There was no need. The simple touch of her hand on his arm said more than words could express. About comfort, about acceptance, about the healing power of human connection. The preacher's warnings still echoed in her mind, but somehow they seemed less important now, here in this quiet space where truth and trust mattered more than appearances. As night settled over the mountains, the wolves' song faded into silence. But the connection forged in that moment of vulnerability remained, as solid and real as the cabin walls around them. The winter of 1878 wrapped the mountains in deep silence. Snow piled in drifts against the cabin walls, and icicles grew long and thick from the eaves. But inside, warmth and purpose filled the days. Daisy found her rhythm in the mountain routine. Each morning she rose before dawn to kindle the fire and prepare breakfast. The smell of coffee and frying salt pork would draw Christian in from his early chores, snow melting from his boots by the door. She learned to keep the cabin in order, not just clean, but prepared. Herbs hung from the rafters, dried and ready for cooking or medicine. Kindling stayed stacked neat and dry beside the hearth. The mule's feed was measured careful and regular, keeping the beast strong through the cold months. Water carrying proved the hardest task. The creek never fully froze, but ice formed thick along its edges. Daisy developed a steady technique for breaking through without soaking herself. She'd return to the cabin with full buckets, her skirts crusted with ice, but her spirits high. Christian watched her growing capability with quiet approval. Gone was the trembling girl from the auction block. In her place stood a woman who met challenges with determination and, increasingly often, with laughter. One crisp morning, as sunlight sparkled off fresh powder, Christian called her outside. "Time you learned about felling trees," he said, shouldering his axe. Daisy followed him into the woods, her boots crunching through the snow crust. Christian stopped before a tall pine, studying its lean. "First rule," he said, "is reading which way it wants to fall. Tree'll tell you if you listen right." He showed her how to clear the snow and smaller branches, how to notch the trunk precisely. The axe felt heavy and awkward in Daisy's hands at first, but Christian guided her patiently. "Like this," he demonstrated, his strong arms swinging in smooth arcs. "Let the weight of the axe do the work." Daisy tried to mirror his technique. Her first few swings went wild, but gradually she found the rhythm. Chips of wood flew as they worked together, their breath clouding in the cold air. The tree gave way with a tremendous crack. "Timber!" Christian called, and they stepped back to watch it fall. The impact shook snow from nearby branches, creating a miniature blizzard. "Now comes the real work," Christian said, eyes twinkling. They set about trimming branches and cutting the trunk into manageable lengths. Dragging the logs became an exercise in teamwork. Christian fashioned a simple harness from rope, and together they pulled each section toward the cabin. Daisy's muscles burned with the effort, but pride burned brighter. She found herself laughing as they worked, the sound echoing off the snow-covered slopes. Near midday, they paused to rest on the fallen tree's stump. Christian produced cornbread, wrapped in a clean cloth, and they shared it in companionable silence. Steam rose from their cooling bodies in the winter air. "Never thought I'd see the day," Christian said finally, brushing crumbs from his beard. "What day?" Daisy asked, still catching her breath. "Day I'd find someone who could work these mountains proper." He met her eyes steadily. "You've got strength in you, Daisy Harland. Real strength, not just the muscle kind." Warmth bloomed in Daisy's chest that had nothing to do with exertion. She ducked her head, unused to praise, but pleased beyond measure. They finished hauling the logs by mid-afternoon. Christian suggested they head to town for supplies before dark. The mule seemed happy for the exercise, trotting along the snowy trail with its head high. The town looked different to Daisy now. The sideways glances held less power to hurt her. She walked straighter, more sure of herself, as they made their way to the general store. Outside the seamstress's shop, Mrs. Monroe herself stood sweeping snow from her steps. She waved them down with excitement. "Miss Harland, how fortunate. I've been hoping you'd come by." She disappeared inside, returning with a wrapped package. "I've had this waiting for you." Daisy accepted the package with confusion. Unwrapping it revealed a dress of deep blue wool, simply cut but beautifully made. The fabric was soft under her fingers, the stitching immaculate. "I can't," Daisy began, but Mrs. Monroe shook her head firmly. "Every woman deserves something beautiful," she said kindly, "especially one working as hard as you do up in those mountains. I've heard tell of how well you're managing." Tears welled in Daisy's eyes. After months of scorn and whispers, this gesture of acceptance and kindness overwhelmed her. She hugged the dress to her chest, unable to speak. Christian cleared his throat. "That's right neighborly of you, Mrs. Monroe," he said gruffly. "Much obliged." The seamstress patted Daisy's arm. "You wear it in good health, dear, and don't be such a stranger. Come visit sometimes when you're in town." They completed their errands as the sun began to set. The ride home was quiet, Daisy lost in thought as she cradled her precious package. Back at the cabin, after the mule was settled and supper eaten, Daisy slipped behind the privacy screen with the dress. Her hands trembled slightly as she changed into it. The wool felt warm and soft against her skin. The fit surprisingly good. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out into the lamplight. Christian looked up from his whittling and went very still. The dress wasn't fancy by town standards. No lace or frills, just clean lines and careful seams. But the deep blue brought out the gold in Daisy's hair, and the proper fit showed her figure to advantage. Months of mountain work had reshaped her from plump to strong, though she hardly realized it herself. She turned slowly, smoothing the skirt with nervous hands. Is it suitable?" Christian seemed to be having trouble finding words. He cleared his throat twice before managing to speak. "You look..." He paused, searching for the right phrase. "Well met by heaven." The simple words, spoken in his deep voice, sent Daisy's heart soaring. She ducked her head to hide her smile, but joy radiated from her, like warmth from the hearth. She thought of that day at the auction, when Christian had called her the fat one to save her from worse mockery. How far they'd come since then. How far she'd come. Here in the lamplight, wearing a dress given in kindness, seen through eyes that valued her strength and spirit, Daisy felt truly beautiful for the first time in her life. The lamp flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, snow continued to fall, adding another layer to the deep winter blanket. But inside, warmth and contentment reigned as Daisy and Christian sat in comfortable silence, each stealing glances at the other when they thought themselves unobserved. The success of the new dress sparked something in Daisy's heart. She wanted to share her joy, to create a moment of warmth that could push back against the long winter nights. An idea began to form, a simple supper, gathering those few souls who had shown her kindness. She approached Christian the next morning as he checked the mule's hooves. "I was thinking," she began, twisting her apron between her fingers. "Perhaps we might have some folk up for supper. Just a few. Mrs. Monroe, the seamstress, and maybe 2 hawks, that Ute scout who's helped you so often." Christian straightened, brushing straw from his pants. "Reckon that'd be fine," he said slowly, "though the cabin ain't exactly built for entertaining." "I'll make it work," Daisy assured him, already planning. "And maybe we could invite Reverend Whitaker, too. Show him there's nothing improper here?" Christian's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. Brave thinking. Might help quiet some tongues in town. Over the next few days, Daisy threw herself into preparations. She scrubbed every surface until the rough-hewn furniture gleamed. New rushes were scattered on the floor, and she hung fresh bundles of dried herbs to sweeten the air. Christian watched her industry with quiet amusement, fetching whatever she needed without complaint. The morning of the supper arrived crisp and clear. Daisy rose before dawn to start the bread, kneading the dough with practiced hands. The cabin filled with the homey scent of baking as the sun climbed higher. Christian had brought her a fat rabbit and some winter vegetables, which she transformed into a hearty stew that simmered promisingly in the iron pot. As afternoon shadows lengthened, she changed into her blue dress and pinned her hair neatly. Christian had gone to fetch their guests in the sled, the winter trail being treacherous after dark. Daisy's hands shook slightly as she arranged tin cups and bowls on the plank table, but excitement outweighed her nervousness. The first sounds of arrival came just as dusk was settling. The jingle of harness bells, the crunch of snow under runners, and voices carrying through the clear mountain air. Daisy straightened her skirts and opened the door wide, letting lamplight spill out onto the snow. Mrs. Monroe entered first, exclaiming, over the warmth and bringing the scent of town with her. Soap and starch and respectability. 2 hawks followed, his weathered face creasing in a slight smile as he nodded to Daisy. He carried himself with quiet dignity, comfortable in both his buckskins and the cabin's civilization. Reverend Whitaker came last, looking somewhat uncertain but polite. "Welcome," Daisy said, her voice steady. "Please come warm yourselves by the fire." Christian helped them shed snow-covered coats and arrange themselves on the benches he'd crafted from split logs. The cabin seemed to expand somehow, making room for them all. Lamplight gleamed on the walls, and the fire crackled welcomingly in the hearth. "Something smells mighty fine," 2 hawks commented, his deep voice carrying the lilt of his native tongue beneath the English words. "Indeed it does," Mrs. Monroe agreed, smiling warmly at Daisy. "You've made this place quite homey, dear." Daisy felt her cheeks warm at the praise as she began serving the stew into waiting bowls. Steam rose fragrantly, carrying the scent of herbs and tender meat. She passed out thick slices of fresh bread, still slightly warm from baking. Reverend Whitaker cleared his throat. Perhaps we might ask a blessing before we begin." "Please do, Reverend," Christian said quietly, and they all bowed their heads. The preacher's voice was unexpectedly gentle as he spoke. "Lord, we thank you for this bounty before us, for the hands that prepared it, and for the shelter of this home on your mountain. Bless this food to our use, and us to your service. Amen." "Amen," the others echoed, and Daisy felt tears prick her eyes at hearing the cabin called a home. The meal began quietly, but soon warmed into easy conversation. 2 hawks shared stories of recent game trails, making them all laugh with his tale of outsmarting a particularly clever fox. Mrs. Monroe spoke of town news, without a hint of gossip, focusing on birth announcements and church socials. Even the Reverend relaxed gradually, complimenting the stew with genuine appreciation. After the bowls were cleaned with the last bits of bread, Mrs. Monroe suggested a hymn. "Something cheerful," she said, "to thank the Lord for good food and better company." "Amazing Grace?" Daisy suggested softly, and at the others' nods, she began the familiar tune. Her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger as the others joined in. Two hawks hummed along, creating a deep harmony that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's bones. The hymn led to another, and another after that. The small room filled with music, some songs known to all, others taught and learned between verses. Daisy's heart felt full to bursting as she looked around at these people who had become, somehow, her community. When the evening drew to its natural close, Christian hitched up the sled to return their guests to town. The farewell was warm, with Mrs. Monroe hugging Daisy tightly, and two hawks pressing a small packet of special tea into her hands. Even Reverend Whitaker's handshake was genuine as he thanked her for the hospitality. "You've made something fine here, Miss Harland," he said, his earlier suspicion replaced by respect. "The Lord's work can be done in many ways, including a well-kept home and a generous table." Daisy stood in the doorway, watching until the sled's bells faded into the distance. The night was clear and cold, stars pricking bright holes in the dark sky. She remained there until Christian returned from the barn after settling the mule. "They're safely on their way," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Two hawks will see them down the mountain proper." Daisy turned to him, her eyes bright. "Did you see?" she whispered. "Did you see how it was? Like a real home, with friends and music and—" She broke off, overcome. Christian stepped closer, taking her work-roughened hands in his larger ones. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. "I saw," he said softly. "Saw how you made it so too. You've got a gift for making folks feel welcome, Daisy Harland." She looked up at him, her heart thundering. "I feel chosen," she whispered. "Not just taken in from pity, but truly chosen. Here, now with these good people around us." Christian's fingers tightened on hers. Something deep and warm flickered in his eyes, and he opened his mouth as if to speak. But whatever words waited there remained unspoken. Instead, he squeezed her hands once more before releasing them. "Best bank the fire for the night," he said gruffly, though his eyes remained soft. Daisy nodded, moving to tend the hearth. The familiar task steadied her racing heart. She arranged the logs carefully, ensuring they would burn slow and steady through the night. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks dancing up the chimney like earthbound stars. The cabin settled around them, creaking gently as the night's cold pressed against its walls. But inside, warmth remained. In the banked coals, in the lingering scents of bread and stew, in the memory of hymns still echoing in the rafters. And most of all, in the quiet certainty that had bloomed in Daisy's heart. She belonged here, chosen and cherished, no longer cast aside but gathered in. The mountain morning dawned bright and cold, frost etching delicate patterns on the cabin's window panes. Daisy hummed softly as she stirred the morning porridge, her heart still warm from the memory of the gathering days before. Christian had already gone out to check his trap lines, promising to return before noon. The quiet peace shattered with the sudden thunder of hoofbeats. A horse and rider appeared through the trees, moving fast despite the treacherous snow. Daisy's hand froze on the wooden spoon as the rider pulled up hard by the cabin door. "Miss Harland," the man called out, his voice urgent. "Message from town." Daisy recognized him as one of the livery stable hands. Her heart clenched as she opened the door, dread settling cold in her stomach. "It's your pa," the rider said, breathing hard. "Took sick with fever 2 nights past. Doc says it's bad, real bad." The porridge pot slipped from Daisy's grip, clattering against the hearth. "How bad?" "Been calling for you in his ravings. Your sister's there, but—" The man shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Might want to hurry." Daisy's world tilted. She grabbed the doorframe to steady herself, then straightened with sudden purpose. "Wait here," she commanded, already reaching for her shawl. "Christian will be back soon. We'll need to know the trail conditions." The wait for Christian's return felt endless. Daisy paced the cabin floor, gathering supplies with trembling hands. Clean linens, dried herbs for tea, the jar of honey she'd been saving. When she finally heard his steady stride on the porch, she burst out the door before he could enter. "Pa's sick," she blurted. "Fever. We have to go, now." Christian took in the scene quickly. The waiting messenger, Daisy's pale face, the hastily gathered supplies. He nodded once, decisive. "I'll saddle the mule and hitch the sled. Pack warm. It's a long ride through deep snow." His calm efficiency steadied her. While Christian prepared for travel, Daisy finished packing, adding extra blankets and food. Her hands shook less as she focused on practical tasks. Within the hour, they were underway. The messenger had gone ahead to report their coming, while Christian guided their mule carefully through the snow-laden forest. Daisy sat beside him on the sled, clutching her supplies, every bump and jolt of the runners intensifying her worry. "He'll hold on," Christian said quietly, reading her thoughts. "Your pa's stubborn as old leather." Daisy tried to smile, but couldn't quite manage it. Harriet must be frantic, alone with him like that. She twisted her hands in her lap. She never did well with sickness, not since Ma. Christian laid a gentle hand over her fidgeting fingers. "We'll be there soon enough." The journey seemed to take forever, though Christian kept them moving as fast as was safe. The winter sun wheeled overhead, shadows stretching long across the snow as afternoon waned. Daisy recognized landmarks with growing anxiety: the lightning-struck pine, the three-boulder formation, the creek bend where she used to gather watercress in summer. Finally, through gathering dusk, she spotted smoke rising from a familiar chimney. The Harland farm looked smaller somehow, more worn than she remembered. No lamplight showed in the windows yet, though evening was falling fast. Christian pulled the mule to a stop by the front door. Before he could help her down, Daisy was already jumping from the sled, stumbling slightly in the deep snow. She reached for the door latch just as it yanked open from inside. Harriet stood in the doorway, her face drawn tight with exhaustion and resentment. "Well," she said coldly, "you finally came." Daisy stepped back as if slapped. "I came as soon as I heard." 3 days, Harriet cut in. "He's been burning up for 3 days while I worked myself to the bone caring for him. Where were you then, sister? Up in your mountain love nest playing at housewife?" "That's enough," Christian said quietly, coming up behind Daisy with their supplies. "Where's your father?" Harriet's lips pressed into a thin line, but she stepped aside. "Back bedroom. Not that either of you care." Daisy pushed past her sister, heading straight for their father's room. The farmhouse's familiar layout felt strange now, like a dress outgrown. The smell hit her first, sick sweat and wood smoke, with an underlying sourness that spoke of severe illness. Amos lay tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, his face flushed with fever. His eyes were open but unseeing, darting around the room as he muttered incomprehensibly. Daisy's heart clenched at how thin he looked, how old. "Pa?" she whispered, touching his burning forehead. "Pa, I'm here now." His eyes focused on her briefly, then slid away. "Sarah?" he called hoarsely. "Sarah, the wheat's failing again?" Daisy blinked back tears. He was calling for their mother. She turned to find Christian in the doorway, his face grave. "We need fresh water," she said, "and clean linens. These are soaked through." He nodded and disappeared. Daisy heard him speaking quietly to Harriet, then the sound of the back door opening and closing. She began her work, gently stripping away the wet bedding, sponging her father's burning skin with what clean water remained in the bedroom pitcher. Harriet appeared with an armful of sheets, hovering in the doorway. "The doctor said the fever needs to break by morning," she said, her voice smaller now. "If it doesn't, it will," Daisy said firmly. "Help me change these linens." The sisters worked together in tense silence, lifting their father's weight to slide fresh sheets beneath him. Outside, they could hear Christian chopping wood and hauling water. The familiar sounds of his industry carried clearly through the winter air. "Your mountain man seems handy enough," Harriet observed, trying for scorn, but achieving only weariness. "He is," Daisy replied simply. She wrung out a fresh cloth and laid it across Amos's forehead. "He's a good man, Harriet. Unlike the father you abandoned?" The bitterness was back in her sister's voice. Daisy turned to face her. "I didn't abandon anyone. Pa sold us both, remember? Or have you forgotten that day at the auction?" Harriet flinched. "At least I stayed nearby. You ran off to the mountains with a stranger." "A stranger who treated me with more kindness than I'd seen in years." Daisy's voice cracked. "What was I supposed to do, Harriet? Stay and watch Pa drink himself to death while the town whispered about his worthless daughters?" "I needed you," Harriet whispered. "Everything fell apart after you left. The crop failed again, Pa started getting sick, and I couldn't handle it alone." Before Daisy could respond, Amos began thrashing, his fever-bright eyes wild. "The rails!" he cried out. "They're coming for the land! Sarah, where are you? The girls!" "Shh! Pa," Daisy soothed, pressing him gently back against the pillows. "We're here. Your girls are here." Christian appeared in the doorway with fresh water and an armload of split wood. Without a word, he began building up the fire in the small bedroom stove. The temperature in the room had dropped with nightfall, and Daisy could see her breath in the air. Through the long night, they worked in shifts. Daisy and Harriet took turns bathing their father's face and chest with cool cloths, trying to break his fever. Christian kept the fires burning, hauled endless buckets of water, and somehow managed to prepare a pot of soup that sat warming on the stove. Amos drifted between past and present, sometimes recognizing his daughters, other times calling out to long-dead friends or arguing with invisible railroad men. Each time his voice rose in distress, Daisy would speak softly to him, grounding him with gentle touches and familiar hymns. Near midnight, Harriet broke down. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, sinking into the room's single chair. "I'm so sorry, Daisy. I was cruel earlier. I've been so scared watching him waste away. And when you came, I've missed you." Daisy crossed to her sister and wrapped her arms around the shaking shoulders. "I'm here now," she whispered. "We'll face this together." From his place by the stove, Christian watched the sisters with quiet approval. When Harriet's tears subsided, he silently handed her a cup of broth, then did the same for Daisy. The night crept forward with agonizing slowness. Amos's fever continued to rage, but his moments of lucidity grew more frequent. Shortly before dawn, his eyes cleared completely for the first time. "Daisy," he croaked, "that really you, girl?" "Yes, Pa," she answered, her heart leaping. "Harriet and I are both here." He squinted at her face in the lamplight. "You look different, stronger." His gaze shifted to Christian, who stood quietly by the door. "You been taking care of my girl, Mountain Man?" "She's been taking care of herself right well," Christian answered. "Just gave her a safe place to do it." Amos closed his eyes, a tear sliding down his weathered cheek. "Shouldn't have tried to sell you girls," he whispered. "Your ma would have had my hide." "Rest now, Pa," Daisy said softly. "We can talk more when you're stronger." The first rays of dawn were painting the eastern sky when Daisy felt her father's forehead again. The burning heat had finally begun to fade. She caught Harriet's eye and nodded, watching relief wash over her sister's tired face. Christian stepped forward with fresh water. "Reckon we'll be staying a while," he said quietly, "till your pa's back on his feet proper." Daisy looked up at him gratefully, reading the unspoken support in his steady gaze. Outside, the morning light sparkled on fresh snow, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. The sound seemed to herald not just a new day, but the possibility of healing, for her father's body, and perhaps for her family's wounded heart as well. The weak winter sun had barely peaked when hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Daisy looked up from where she was wringing out fresh cloths for her father's fever, her heart jumping at the sound of multiple horses approaching. Christian moved to the window, his broad shoulders tensing. "Rail company men," he said grimly, "and soldiers with them." Harriet rushed to look. "What do they want? The notice said spring—" Before she could finish, heavy boots stomped onto the porch. The door burst open without a knock, and 3 men in fine wool coats strode in, followed by 2 soldiers in blue uniforms. Their leader, a thin-faced man with cold eyes, held up a sheaf of papers. "By order of the Western Pacific Railroad Company, this property is hereby seized for immediate track expansion," he announced, his voice clipped and formal. "All residents must vacate by sundown." "That's impossible," Daisy protested, stepping forward. "Our father is desperately ill. The original notice gave us until spring." "Plans have changed," the rail agent cut her off. "The company requires this land now. Your father's condition is unfortunate but irrelevant to our timeline." Christian moved between the men and Daisy. "Show some humanity," he said quietly. "Give them at least a week to move their sick father." The agent's lip curled. "I don't believe you have any standing here, Mountain Man. This is a legal matter between the railroad and the Harland family." One of the soldiers stepped forward, hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol. "Sir, if you interfere with official railroad business, we'll have no choice but to arrest you." "You can't do this!" Harriet cried. Her face twisted with sudden fury as she whirled on Daisy. "This is your doing. Ever since that shameful day at the auction, you've brought nothing but trouble and ruin to this family." Daisy staggered back as if struck. Tears sprang to her eyes as her sister's words hit their mark, reopening wounds she'd thought were healing. "Harriet, I never— If you hadn't run off to play house in the mountains with him—" Harriet jabbed a finger at Christian. "Maybe Pa wouldn't have taken sick. Maybe we could have fought this together, but no, you abandoned us, just like you always do when things get hard." "That's enough," Christian said sharply, but Harriet was beyond hearing. "Look at you now, crying like always. Weak, useless Daisy, who can't even face—" "I said enough!" Christian's voice cracked like a whip, silencing the room. Even the rail agents looked startled. He turned to them, his eyes hard. "You'll give us until sunset tomorrow. Not negotiable." The lead agent opened his mouth to argue, but something in Christian's stance made him reconsider. 24 hours, he said stiffly. "Not 1 minute more." He placed the papers on the table with deliberate precision. "We'll return tomorrow with wagons to clear the property." The men filed out, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. The door slammed behind them, leaving a terrible silence broken only by Daisy's quiet sobs and the rasp of Amos's labored breathing from the bedroom. Harriet stood rigid, her face white with spent anger. Without another word, she turned and fled to the back of the house. The sound of her bedroom door slamming echoed through the cabin. Daisy sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking. The weight of her sister's accusations, the impossible deadline, her father's illness, it all crashed over her like a wave, threatening to pull her under. She felt Christian's strong hand on her shoulder but couldn't look up. "She's wrong, you know," he said softly. "Is she?" Daisy whispered. Everything she said came from fear and exhaustion," Christian interrupted gently. "Not truth." From the bedroom came the sound of Amos coughing, harsh and wet. Daisy moved automatically to check on him, but Christian caught her arm. "Wait," he said, and something in his voice made her pause. He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "There's something I need to tell you first." Daisy looked up at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his expression. "These past weeks," he began slowly, "watching you grow stronger, seeing your light shine through all the hurt, it's awakened something in me I thought was dead." He swallowed hard. "And now I'm terrified." "Of what?" "Of losing you to this despair, of watching it dim your spirit like it dimmed mine after Sarah died." His voice roughened. "I can't bear to see you blame yourself for things beyond your control, the way I did for so long." Daisy's tears slowed as she absorbed his words. The lamp on the table flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with bitter determination. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "It feels like everything's slipping away." Christian's hand tightened on her shoulder. "Then do what you taught me to do again. Pray." Daisy closed her eyes, remembering the comfort she'd found in prayer since coming to Christian's cabin. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to speak. "Lord," she whispered, "I'm lost in darkness right now. My father's sick, my sister's hurting, our land's being taken." Her voice cracked. "I need your strength, Lord, not just for me, but for all of us. Show us the way through this valley." "Amen," Christian murmured. Then, to her surprise, he continued praying. "Lord, thank you for bringing this strong woman into my life. Help me support her as you've called me to do. Give us wisdom to face what's coming." Their voices wove together in the dim lamplight, a harmony of faith and need. Daisy felt something settle in her spirit. Not peace exactly, but a steadiness she desperately needed. The problems hadn't changed, but she no longer felt crushed by them. A sound from the doorway made them look up. Harriet stood there, her face tear-stained but calmer. "Pa's asking for you," she said quietly to Daisy. Then, with visible effort, she added, "I'm sorry for what I said before. I was scared and cruel." Daisy crossed to her sister and took her hands. "I know. I'm sorry too. Sorry I wasn't here when you needed me." "We need each other now," Harriet said, managing a weak smile. "All of us." Christian nodded approvingly. "Then let's tend to your father and make plans. Together." They moved toward Amos's room as one, the lamp's glow following them like a blessing. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside, something had shifted. Prayer had done what it always did, not removing the storm, but anchoring them firmly against it. Through the bedroom window, they could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now they faced them with renewed strength, their faith a quiet flame against the gathering night. Dawn painted the snow-covered hills in shades of pearl and gold as Christian guided his mule along a narrow trail. The morning air bit sharp and clean, his breath rising in clouds before him. He'd left Daisy tending to Amos, promising to return with help. Now he followed tracks only his experienced eye could see, heading toward the winter camp of Grey Wolf, the Ute scout who'd become a trusted friend over the years. The sound of wood smoke guided him to a sheltered hollow where several hide-covered lodges stood. Children playing in the snow spotted him first, calling out in their language. Grey Wolf emerged from the largest lodge, wrapped in a wool blanket against the cold. His weathered face creased in welcome. "Brother," he greeted Christian in English, gesturing him to dismount. "You come early with trouble in your eyes." Christian tied his mule to a pine and clasped the older man's offered hand. "Need your counsel, friend. The railroad's trying to take the Harland land, Daisy's family place." Grey Wolf nodded slowly, leading Christian into his lodge where a small fire burned. The scout's wife silently offered them steaming cups of pine needle tea. They sat cross-legged on woven blankets, letting the warmth seep into their bones. "Tell me," Grey Wolf said simply. Christian explained the situation: Amos's illness, the railroad's sudden demand, the soldiers' threats. Grey Wolf listened without interruption, his dark eyes thoughtful. When Christian finished, the scout rose and went to a leather bag hanging from a lodge pole. From it, he drew out a rolled piece of parchment, yellowed with age. "Many winters ago," he said, carefully unrolling the document, "when my father's father treated with the government, they made this map." His finger traced lines drawn in faded ink. "Shows the hunting grounds promised to our people. Never changed, though many promises were broken." Christian leaned forward, studying the carefully drawn boundaries. His eyes widened as he realized what he was seeing. "The Harland farm. It's within these lines?" Grey Wolf nodded. "The railroad men, they think the land belongs to no one but themselves and those who hold paper from the territory. But older papers exist." A slight smile touched his lips. "Papers they do not wish to remember." Hope sparked in Christian's chest. This could stop them? Perhaps. Grey Wolf rolled the map carefully. "They will not like it. But the treaty still stands. Even their law must respect it, if forced to see it." Christian gripped his friend's shoulder. "Would you come? Help us show them?" Grey Wolf wrapped the map in soft leather. "I will come. These mountains were our hunting grounds before any rails crossed them. It is time to remind them." Back at the Harland farm, Daisy sat beside her father's bed, wringing out a cool cloth to lay across his burning forehead. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving Amos weak but lucid. His eyes, clear for the first time in days, followed her movements. "Daisy," he whispered hoarsely. "My girl." She paused, her heart catching at the gentleness in his voice, so different from his bitter words at the auction. "I'm here, Pa." "Been thinking," he said, each word an effort. "About what I did, offering you and your sister like cattle." His face twisted with shame. "No father should ever—" "Pa, don't," Daisy tried to interrupt, but he gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Let me speak. Been carrying this too long?" He drew a shuddering breath. "Was desperate, farm failing, debts mounting. Thought I was doing right, finding you both proper husbands who could provide. But it wasn't right. Was cruel. My shame, not yours." Tears spilled down Daisy's cheeks, dropping onto their clasped hands. "I forgive you, Pa," she whispered. "Don't deserve it," he muttered. "That mountain man, Christian, he saw your worth when I was blind to it, treated you with respect I should have given." "He's a good man," Daisy said softly. Amos managed a weak smile. "Reckon he is. Reckon I owe him thanks for seeing what a fool I'd become." Harriet appeared in the doorway with a bowl of broth. She'd been more subdued since their prayer the night before, helping quietly where she could. "You should rest, Pa," she said, moving to help him sit up. "Save your strength." The afternoon sun was casting long shadows when Christian returned with Grey Wolf. Daisy met them at the door, hope rising at the purpose in their expressions. They gathered around the rough kitchen table, Christian, Daisy, Harriet, and Grey Wolf, while the scout carefully unrolled the treaty map. "Look here," Christian explained, pointing to the boundaries. "The railroad's claim isn't as solid as they think. This land was guaranteed to the Ute people for hunting grounds. They can't just seize it without addressing the treaty rights first." Harriet leaned forward, studying the faded lines. "But will they—" "Listen, they have soldiers with them." "They must listen," Grey Wolf said firmly. "Their own laws require it. The treaty was signed by their government, not just ours." The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the window, they could see the railroad men returning as promised, 2 wagons following behind. The foreman's face darkened when he saw Grey Wolf at the table with the treaty map spread before him. "This changes nothing," he snapped when they explained. "That treaty is ancient history." "Treaties don't expire," Grey Wolf replied calmly, "unless officially negated by both parties. This one stands. I won't be lectured about legal matters by someone who knows the law better than you." Christian cut in, his voice hard. "This is legitimate treaty land. You try to seize it without proper consideration of those rights, and there'll be more than local papers hearing about it." The foreman's face reddened. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Christian said quietly. "Just promising that justice will be served, one way or another." A tense silence followed. The foreman looked from the map to Grey Wolf's impassive face, to the determined set of Christian's jaw. Finally, he turned to his men. "Pack up. We need to consult with the company lawyers." After they'd gone, relief flooded the cabin. Harriet hugged Daisy impulsively, then rushed to tell their father the news. Grey Wolf declined their invitation to stay, saying he'd return if needed, leaving Christian and Daisy alone in the gathering dusk. They stood by the window, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The day's events seemed to hover between them, full of unspoken meaning. "Thank you," Daisy said softly, "for everything." Christian turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in the fading light. "Daisy, I need to tell you something." He paused, struggling with words. "When Sarah died, I walled myself off. Thought I'd never risk loving again. The pain was too much." Daisy's heart quickened, but she stayed silent, letting him continue. "But these past weeks, watching you face your own hurts with such courage, something in me started to change." His voice roughened. "Started to want things I thought I'd buried forever. Started to feel what I swore I wouldn't feel again." "And that frightens you?" she asked gently. "More than I can say." He ran a hand through his hair. "I look at you, and I see everything I ever wanted, everything I lost once already. The thought of losing you, too." Daisy stepped closer, laying a hand on his arm. "Love is always a risk," she said softly. "But it's also how we heal, how we find redemption." She smiled up at him. "You taught me that, Christian, by choosing me that day at the auction, by seeing worth in me when I couldn't see it myself." Christian covered her hand with his own. "You found your own worth, Daisy. I just had the good sense to recognize it." They stood there in the deepening twilight, the warmth of their joined hands speaking volumes that words couldn't express. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called to its mate. Inside the cabin, 2 hearts that had known loss and pain began to beat with a new rhythm, the cadence of hope, of healing, of love cautiously reborn. From the bedroom came the sound of Harriet humming an old hymn as she tended to their father. The familiar melody wrapped around them like a blessing, a reminder that even in the darkest valleys, light could find its way through. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as Christian's wagon rolled into town. Daisy sat beside him on the rough wooden seat, her back straight despite her racing heart. Behind them, Grey Wolf rode his pinto horse with quiet dignity, while Reverend Miller followed in his buggy, the treaty map carefully stored in an oilskin wrap. The meeting hall stood weather-beaten but proud at the town's center. Already people gathered on the steps, drawn by word that spread like wildfire about a challenge to the railroad's claims. The rail company foreman, Mr. Carver, stood with several agents near the door, his face dark with irritation. Christian helped Daisy down from the wagon, his strong hand steady at her waist. She smoothed her simple dress, remembering how far she had come from that day at the livestock auction. The same townsfolk who had laughed then now nodded in greeting, something like respect in their eyes. Inside, the hall filled quickly. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, catching motes in its beams. The wooden floors creaked under boots and Sunday shoes as people found seats on the plain benches. At the front table sat the mayor and town council, looking uncomfortable in their formal wear. Christian stepped forward, his voice carrying clear and strong through the quiet room. "We've come about the Harland land claim and the railroad's attempts to seize it." He nodded to Grey Wolf, who carefully unrolled the treaty map across the table. The scout's fingers traced the boundaries marked in faded ink. "These lands were guaranteed to my people for hunting grounds by solemn treaty." His calm words held weight earned through generations. "The document bears the signatures of both your government and our chiefs. It has never been legally dissolved." Mr. Carver pushed forward, face flushed. "That treaty is ancient history. Progress cannot be stopped by outdated papers. God's laws regarding promises and truth do not age." Reverend Miller spoke up, his clerical collar lending authority to his words. "When we break faith with our neighbors, we break faith with the Almighty Himself." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The seamstress who had gifted Daisy her dress stood up. "I remember when my father signed that treaty. He said a man's word should be as solid as the mountains themselves." Other voices joined in, sharing memories of promises made and kept, of times when a handshake meant as much as any written contract. The mayor leaned forward, studying the map with careful attention. Daisy felt Christian's fingers brush against hers. She gripped his hand, drawing strength from his presence as she had these past months. Looking around the hall, she saw not the cruel faces that had mocked her, but neighbors beginning to choose justice over expediency. Mr. Carver's voice cut through the growing consensus. "The railroad has invested thousands of dollars in this expansion. We have shareholders to answer to, schedules to keep." "And we have our honor to keep," Christian replied evenly. "There are other routes that don't violate treaty lands, routes that won't destroy a family's home." Grey Wolf stepped closer to the council table. "My people have watched many treaties turn to dust, but today you have a chance to show that your word still holds meaning, that progress need not come at the cost of broken promises." The mayor cleared his throat. "Mr. Carver, with these witnesses and this documentation, I cannot in good conscience support the railroad's claim to the Harland property. The treaty rights must be respected." The rail foreman's face darkened further, but he glanced around the room and saw the tide had turned. Too many witnesses, too many respected voices raised in opposition. With a curse under his breath, he snatched his hat from the table. "The company will hear about this interference," he snapped, but his threat sounded hollow in the quiet hall. "They'll hear about justice being served," Reverend Miller corrected firmly. about a community choosing to honor its obligations. Mr. Carver stormed out, his agents trailing behind him. As the door slammed, a release of tension rippled through the crowd. Daisy felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Christian's hand tightened on hers, solid and reassuring as the mountains themselves. The mayor stood, making it official. Let the record show that the Harland land claim stands protected by prior treaty rights. The railroad must seek an alternate route. People began to file out, stopping to shake Christian's hand or pat Daisy's shoulder. The seamstress hugged her tight, whispering, "Your mama would be proud, child." Grey Wolf carefully rolled the treaty map, its precious boundaries now renewed in memory and law. Reverend Miller beamed like a father whose children had chosen the righteous path. Standing in the stream of sunlight from the dusty windows, Daisy clasped Christian's hand tight, feeling the pulse of victory in her heart. Justice had prevailed, not through force, but through the power of community united in truth. The wagon wheels crunched through fresh snow as Christian and Daisy returned to the Harland homestead. Late afternoon sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and rose, casting long shadows across the pristine white blanket covering the yard. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcome sight after their victory in town. Harriet met them at the door, her face softer than before. "Papa's been asking for you," she said, stepping aside to let them enter. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth from the hearth. Amos sat propped up in his bed, color returning to his cheeks. Though still weak, his eyes were clear and alert as Daisy approached. "We won, Papa," Daisy said, kneeling beside him. "The railroad can't take our land. The treaty map saved it." Her voice trembled with emotion as she explained how the town had stood with them, how justice had prevailed. Amos reached out with a weathered hand to touch her cheek. "My girl," he whispered, his voice rough with feeling. "I did you wrong that day at auction. Shame and desperation poisoned my heart." "It's past now," Daisy assured him, covering his hand with hers. "No," Amos insisted, struggling to sit straighter. "Need to say this proper." He looked at Christian, who stood quietly by the fire. "You asked for the fat one that day. Turned out you chose the strong one. The best one." His eyes welled with tears. "I see it clear now. Your strength, Daisy. Your mama's strength living in you." Christian moved to stand behind Daisy, his presence steady and sure. Amos looked up at him, then back to his daughter. "You have my blessing, both of you. You've earned it fair and true." Daisy's heart swelled with joy and healing. She turned to her sister, who stood with hands clasped tight. "Harriet," she said softly, opening her arms. Harriet's composure broke. She rushed forward into Daisy's embrace. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I was so scared and mean-spirited. Can you forgive me?" "Already have," Daisy whispered, holding her sister close. "We're family." Christian added wood to the fire as snow began falling outside, soft flakes drifting past the window in the gathering dusk. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as the family drew together, Amos in his bed, the sisters still embracing, Christian watching over them all. Daisy felt peace settle in her heart, deep and true. Here in this humble cabin, surrounded by those she loved, she had found something she never imagined possible, not just acceptance, but celebration of who she truly was. Strong, worthy, beloved. Warm spring sunshine bathed the little white church in golden light. Inside, wildflowers gathered by townsfolk brightened every windowsill, their sweet perfume mingling with fresh-cut pine boughs. The wooden pews, worn smooth by generations of worship, filled with neighbors dressed in their Sunday best. The seamstress sat near the front, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief even before the ceremony began. She had spent extra hours adding delicate touches to Daisy's gifted dress, tiny pearl buttons down the back, soft lace at the collar. The Ute Scout stood quietly at the back, his presence a dignified reminder of the justice that had brought them to this day. Christian waited by the altar, his usually weathered face clean-shaven, his dark hair neatly combed. He wore a new shirt and his best wool vest, though his hands still bore the honest calluses of mountain work. The preacher stood beside him, Bible ready, his earlier doubts transformed to wholehearted support. When the door opened, sunlight streamed in, creating a path of gold down the center aisle. Harriet entered first, wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes, her smile genuine as she took her place. Then Daisy appeared, and the congregation drew in a collective breath. She wore the seamstress's dress, now altered to fit her perfectly. Her cheeks glowed with health and joy, her steps steady and sure. Spring light caught the copper highlights in her hair, forming a natural crown. Amos, still recovering but determined, walked slowly beside her, pride evident in every step. Christian's eyes never left Daisy as she approached. His hands trembled slightly when he took hers, rough fingers gentle against her soft palms. The preacher's words rang clear through the hushed church. "What God has brought together, let no man put asunder." The congregation joined in singing hymns, their voices rising to the rafters. "Amazing Grace" echoed off the whitewashed walls, followed by "Blessed Assurance." Even those who had once whispered cruel words now sang with genuine gladness. When Christian kissed his bride, sunlight poured through the windows, surrounding them in a golden glow. Daisy's heart soared with the certainty of being truly, completely chosen. The love in Christian's eyes spoke of redemption, of second chances, of faith rewarded. The scout nodded respectfully as they passed, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory for justice. The seamstress wept happy tears into her handkerchief, beaming through them at the couple she had helped bring together. As they stepped out into the spring morning as husband and wife, the church bells rang joyfully across the valley. Daisy squeezed Christian's hand, feeling wholly loved, wholly complete. Their path ahead lay bright and clear, blessed by God and community alike. The last rays of sunset painted the mountain peaks in amber and rose as Christian's mule carried them steadily up the familiar trail to their cabin. The wedding celebrations in town had been joyful, but simple, and now, as dusk settled over the land, they were finally heading home. Christian helped Daisy down from the mule, his strong hands gentle at her waist. She gathered her skirts, still wearing the dress that had brought such joy earlier that day. The cabin stood welcoming against the darkening sky, its rough-hewn logs holding memories of their first uncertain days together. Inside, Daisy moved with sure steps to the shelf where the lamp sat waiting. Her fingers, no longer trembling as they had months ago, struck the match and touched it to the wick. Golden light bloomed in the cabin, casting warm shadows on the walls that had witnessed their growing love. Christian stepped close behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. He covered her hand with his own, where it rested on the lamp base, his wedding ring catching the light. "Never again," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "will shame touch you. Not while I draw breath." Daisy turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. "I know now," she said softly. "I was never truly unwanted. Not in God's eyes, and not in yours." Beyond their windows, the eternal mountain stood sentinel against the deepening night. Spring's warm breath was melting winter's hold, sending clear streams dancing down the slopes. Inside their cabin, the hearth crackled with welcome warmth, its glow matching the contentment in their hearts. Two souls who had known loneliness and loss had found their way home at last, together. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.